Good evening, fellow environmentalists and mindset changers. As Mizu Eco Care, we're taking part in the World River Run. We're running for the Chalimbana River and the Zambezi River. But before we get into the run itself, we thought it's important to talk about what exactly ecosystems are. What is an ecosystem? The year 2021 to the year 2030 is the decade for ecosystem restoration. So when we talk about ecosystem restoration, what exactly are these ecosystems we are restoring? So we start with the definition of an ecosystem. It's a collection of living organisms in a particular area. An ecosystem is a collection of living organisms in a particular area. Let's go step by step and understand what this statement means. The first thing we need to look at is a collection of living organisms. So when we talk about a collection of living organisms, we are specifically referring to a community of living organisms. What do we mean when we refer to a community of living organisms? We're talking about living organisms that are interacting with each other. So you've got various species that are living in this particular area that are actually interacting amongst themselves. These interactions amongst themselves take various forms. They could be mutually beneficial, they could be negative, they could be cooperative, but the point is there is an interaction taking place. So when we talk about these interactions, we could be talking about food webs, how predators would hunt prey, how parasites will feed off their hosts. There are different types of relationships and interactions taking place. And these are represented by the community of living organisms. Where are these interactions taking place? In a particular area or a particular place. So you notice, in order for you to have an ecosystem, it's imperative that you have a community of living organisms. It's also imperative that you have a particular area. When we talk about the interactions, you will note that the interactions are not only taking place amongst the living organisms themselves, they are also taking place between the living organisms and the area. So we're talking about an interaction between the living component of the ecosystem and the non-living component. So if we give specific examples of ecosystems, if we give specific examples of ecosystems, we could give the example of a forest. You will notice in a forest you will have trees and you will have various animals, both small and large. We refer collectively to all of them as organisms. You will have the soil. You could have a river passing through that particular forest. You will notice you've got different components that are interacting with each other. Some are living, some are non-living, but they create this perfect balance in this ecosystem. Because everything in this ecosystem is perfectly balanced in the way it's interacting, this ecosystem becomes healthy. It becomes a system that is sustainable. But when activities take place in this ecosystem, which is a forest, when we begin to cut down trees, So let's imagine we have a forest. These trees are on land. You notice there will be animals down there, there will be microorganisms in the soil. You have a perfect balance of everything that's in existence in this particular forest. So it's a healthy forest. It's an ecosystem that's got biodiversity, a variety of living organisms, and is thriving. But the moment we start cutting down trees and disturbing this soil, we begin to affect the health of the ecosystem. So the quality of life reduces. This ecosystem undergoes degradation. There's a reduction in the quality of life for the living organisms. There's a reduction in the quality of life for the non-living component, which is the soil. So when you degrade an ecosystem like a forest, it becomes important that you restore that health. Hence the term ecosystem restoration. So how are you going to restore the health of this ecosystem? You make sure if what you lost were the trees, you begin to plant trees in there. You will notice if this forest is an indigenous forest, it's important that the restoration mimics the old system as it was when it was healthy. So you're going to emphasize the planting of indigenous plants. If you plant exotic plants or trees in this forest to replace the indigenous trees you lost, you will notice that you will never be able to attain the maximum level of health because the exotic plants or trees are foreign to the area. So the emphasis will be on planting the right type of trees. You will notice once you cut down the big trees, it will take you a long time to restore this forest. It will take you years. That's why it's important for us to think twice before we disturb an ecosystem. Because restoring it or allowing it to regenerate takes a long time. Just because you plant 20 young saplings, 20 young plants, does not mean you will replace that one giant tree you've just brought down. Because the ecological functions of a large tree take many years to mature, and they are at a high and advanced level compared to the ecological functions of 20 small plants. That's the reason why we need to think twice before we destroy or degrade or disturb an ecosystem. So that's a general example referring to forests. When we talk about rivers, which is what we are running for, rivers can also be an ecosystem where the place or area is that aquatic body you have, which is the running water, but it's got various living organisms inside. It's also a healthy ecosystem. But we as human beings could disturb that particular ecosystem. How? By having poor farming practices on the terrestrial surface, on the land, so that the pesticides and the chemicals that we're using and the fertilizers find their way into the rivers and create an imbalance in the ecosystem of that particular river. It could also lead to an imbalance in terms of the death of species in that river because of the poisons that we're putting in. We could also be talking about waste like sewage waste that we're putting into that particular stream. The moment the living organisms begin to die off, the ecosystem also begins to die and becomes unhealthy. So you will notice we talk about dead rivers. Dead rivers are aquatic ecosystems, rivers that actually have no life in them. So it's no longer an ecosystem because in order for you to have an ecosystem, living organisms must be thriving in that ecosystem. It must be sustainable for those living organisms. The moment the living organisms in that particular ecosystem cannot sustain themselves, that ecosystem crashes or dies. We also disturb river ecosystems by building dams, because dams are not a natural phenomenon for these rivers. you disturb the way of life of a number of species in the river. You disturb the rate at which soil particles and other particles are being carried by the river. That dam actually blocks the particles and they begin to accumulate right at that dam. So the life and ecosystems downstream are never the same because of that dam you've put. So we're not saying dams are not important. Dams are important. We've got the Kariba Dam that gives us hydroelectric power. But it's important to control the number of dams you have, because eventually dams do disturb the ecological or ecosystem balance of rivers and streams. We are particularly interested in the Zambezi because that's the mother river of Zambia. It cuts across a huge portion of our country, and runs along another portion of our country. And you know, where you have water, you have living organisms coming close. You have wildlife that comes close to the water. So wherever you have a river running, you will have biodiversity that's thriving. If the river dies, the biodiversity also dies. That's why we want the Zambezi to always be protected and conserved. We have the Chalimbana River, which starts from Forest 27. The reason why we talk about Forest 27 being protected is because Forest 27 is the catchment area for the Chalimbana River. The quality of life in the Chalimbana River is dependent on that forest. If you damage the forest, the Chalimbana River itself will be affected. And so will all the communities that thrive and survive from benefiting from this river downstream all the way to Chongwe, where it actually joins the Chongwe River. So we just thought we should give an explanation of what an ecosystem is and how rivers are also part of ecosystems or are ecosystems themselves. So ecosystems are important because they are found everywhere. The size does not matter. It could be an entire huge forest. It could be a biome. It could be a savanna. It could be a huge landscape like a savanna or the Congo forest. All those are examples of various ecosystems. Even when you talk about biomes, biomes are made up of a collection of ecosystems. So the basic unit for biodiversity is actually the ecosystem itself. The ecosystem has to be healthy in order for it to thrive. It needs a variety of living organisms in order for it to be sustainable. The moment you disturb the ecosystem, you disturb the quality of life, you begin to lose the biodiversity, and that ecosystem eventually dies. You will notice us as human beings depend so much on ecosystems. We draw certain benefits from ecosystems, and those benefits are referred to as ecosystem services. If the ecosystems disappear, guess who suffers the most? Us as human beings. So when we talk about taking care of ecosystems, we should not only be concerned about the short-term benefits we get from destroying them because we're cutting down logs because we want to make quick money, or burning charcoal because we want to make quick money. We should be concerned about what the quality of life will be in the next 30, 50, 100 years. Even long before we are gone, long after we are gone, what will the quality of life be for the people that will be remaining? Will the ecosystems be healthy enough to sustain them? That's a question we should be concerned about in the present moment. Thank you for listening to this explanation for what ecosystems are and why they're important and how we can connect them to forests and rivers. We hope you join in the World River Run. It ends on the 5th of June, which is World Environmental Day. So there's still time to join. Thanks for listening and join us next time. We're going for the run now.